Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well, and I'm once again joined by Lindsay, Powell, and last time we discussed his most recent book, Tiberius, which he still holds the record for the longest recorded episode of this podcast's history, which is over 3 hours and 9 minutes. If the full version is on YouTube, I unfortunately had to cut the end for the file for the podcast version of the episode, but it's a great episode and a great book overall. But this time we are going to discuss his predecessor. So in a way, this is about a prequel to our episode on Tiberius, and it's also a sequel kind of to our episode three-part series we did on the Roman Republic a few weeks ago. So you can also watch all those episodes back to back for the full enjoyment if you want a full consistent episodes of the Roman history. And we don't have too much time this week, unfortunately. So let's just get started. Welcome back, and it's a great pleasure, as always, to have you here. Let's begin with the early life of Augustus, or as we shall call him before he's known as Augustus, Octavian. And we don't, from my understanding, we don't really know too much about this young life as a young man, or his family for that matter. They're kind of a little bit obscure in history. So let's begin with what we do know from his, early life.
Hello, Erlend, and thank you for inviting me back. It's always great to be here. So we actually do know some things about his early life. First of all, of course, we have Suetonius, who, in the recent translation by Tom Holland, which is very good. So we know a lot about the life of the younger man you called Octavian, but we also have a book by Nicolaus of Damascus, which a lot of people forget. And this is very definitely the younger Augustus as a teenager going into the years when he becomes the heir to Julius Caesar. So Nicolaus of Augustus, Nicolaus of Damascus is certainly a source worth checking out. And there's translations out on the internet. You can read them free of charge. So what do we know? Well, he's born in 63. He's born on 23rd of September, right in the middle of a very difficult year. Cicero is the consul. Cicero makes out that he saves the Roman Republic in 63 BC. If you remember, it's the
Mm.
Catalinian conspiracy,
Yeah.
which you may have covered in the last episode. So he grows up already in a world where some of and the certainties maybe of previous generations look uncertain. And of course, out of 63 comes really the rise of the great figures of Pompeius, Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, of course, Crassus to some
Mm.
degree. And these people really make their mark on the political scene. And in that shadow is where the young, and his name is at this point Caius Turnus, Octavius Turnus. So that's one of the things we have to understand. He's a young man who's pretty much unknown, right?
Yeah.
He grows up in Rome. He's educated in Rome and forms friendships with several people, including Marcus Agrippa, probably my favorite Roman. And he comes to the attention of his great uncle, Julius Caesar. And whether he was aware of it seems unlikely. He was made his heir in Julius Caesar's will. And significantly, that will change his life completely. But he doesn't know
Mm.
that till he's about 18, 19.
What do we know
So,
about his family? That we know that you said he's an great uncle of, great nephew, sorry, of Caesar. But what about his birth parental family? They don't seem to know much about. They seem to be of high birth standard, but they didn't seem to be
no,
quite
that's true.
wealthy at this time.
Yeah, we know who his mother was. We know that his father was fairly, I would say, nondescript individual. I think the family came from Thurii, which is the Turinus connection. And really, there's nothing terribly exciting or, shall we say, tragic in his background that points to the fact he's going to be probably one of the most notable figures in history. And there's also another part I'm going to bring into this. Let's remember how we know our history of that time. So it's very clear when you read Suetonius, there were several books written by Julius Caesar, for example, where he had speeches and comedies and the sayings of and all sorts of stuff that people don't normally think Julius Caesar wrote. They only know him basically for his war commentaries. But
Mm,
but Augustus decided that they should be taken out of circulation. There was a certain image of his great uncle that he wanted propagated. And I think in the same way, he would have approached people examining his past too closely would be discouraged as well. So the idea of him being this important figure, a transformative figure in Roman history, wouldn't be best served as being an ordinary bloke in Rome who happened to come to the attention of arguably probably the most important Roman you add all those things up, and I think that there's a case to be made that we don't know a lot, partly because I think it was suppressed. What his story really comes into existence is as the a person who avenges the death of the assassinated Julius Caesar, and then how he goes on to take on the renegade queen Cleopatra and her associate Marcus Antonius, and the rest. So I think those are the things that really he would want to be seen
mm.
to be famous for. And the past, his young past, is kind of unimpressive, except for the fact that what we do know in his
You're breaking up a little bit.
middle 15, 16, something like that. Am I? Um,
It's fine
okay.
now. Don't worry.
Uh, I think what we have to what I think we should also remember is that there are some highlights that we do know about as a teenager. And for example, having been identified as someone of interest to Julius
Mm,
Caesar, he's put in different positions where he could actually show his talents. And he's invited, for example, to join him in his campaign against Pompey the Great and Sextus Pompeius in Spain. So he goes out on a journey, and from what I gather, is late to the party. The battle's pretty much over by the time he reaches Spain. He's also placed in positions where he will be in charge of entertainments in Rome,
mm,
surprisingly. So he's put in a position where he has to present important facets of Caesar's regime to the public to keep the public on the side of Julius Caesar. And then probably the most important thing, which positions him for greatness, is the fact that Caesar decides that he's now going to invade Parthia and the Getae and the Sarmatians. And
mm,
what he does is that he's planning a campaign and he sends the young Octavian, and he takes his friends with him as well, to go to Apollonia
mm,
in the Balkans to be trained by soldiers and officers of the Fifth Macedonian Legion. So what he's being identified is you're going to have to grow up fast. We're going to teach you leadership command um, skills. We're going to teach you how to ride a horse and throw a spear and use a sword properly. And he finds himself in 45 BC, going into 44 BC, in the Western Balkans.
mm,
And that's important because he's away from the city of Rome at the time of the Ides of March 44
mm.
BC.
So how close is he to his, because we know that Caesar of course adopt him into his son and becomes and is groomed into being the heir from that time on, or is it how does Caesar have other heirs in mind to put it that way that take over after his death? And how close are they, Caesar and they must be seem to be fairly close because Caesar does adopt him as an adoptive son as well.
Yeah, there are rumors in I think it's Suetonius, and it's almost impossible to prove that Caesar may have had sexual relations with the young man. This wouldn't have been unusual in the time we're talking about. Uh, and that may also be part of a sort of campaign that Marcus Antonius waged against Octavian in the
Propaganda.
Actian War. So you could argue how close was he? Possibly about as close as you can get.
Hmm. I mean, there's a lot of sexual rumors about Caesar, to be fair.
Yes, of course, and similarly of Octavian, and similarly of Marcus Antonius, and similarly of Tiberius. So it is part of a tradition in Roman rhetoric to basically character assassinate the
Hmm.
person, and it's a technique they use, which is developed and is seen as the normal routine. And in fact, when you read the accounts of Suetonius and Tacitus and some of these other historians, you have to be aware that there is this element that the writer, the presenter, the orator is trying to create a caricature in the mind of the reader or listener in order to bring them down, to throw mud at them and see what will stick. And that's normal practice in Rome of this time.
So where does Livia come into the picture? Because we know, and I'm reading Anthony Everett's biography of Augustus at the moment, but
Yes.
he is married before Livia, but it doesn't seem to be very successful. And according to Everett, he does also get a daughter that died in infancy, a daughter or son, I don't remember. But
Yeah,
it doesn't seem to be a
he
happy
married.
marriage, the first one.
So the context is this, is that marriages in that time
Yeah.
are often political marriages. They're not ones of love, although love may in fact go on to blossom. And I think in the case of Augustus and Livia, that was what they had ultimately. As I recall, I think it was Scribonia was Augustus' wife originally, and in the period of about I think it was 38, 39 BC, the young Livia Drusilla comes to his attention, and he's quite smitten. And Augustus is himself. I mean, he's born in 63, so we're talking 39. He's not very old. He's in his 20s. So at this point, he's still growing his sort of facial hair, his beard, right? And he decides he wants to have her. And what's very interesting is the husband of Livia at this time is in fact the father of the man Tiberius that we know as the Emperor Tiberius and his brother Drusus, of which I've written two books. And his name is Tiberius Claudius Nero. And Tiberius Claudius Nero is in fact on the side of Julius Caesar, so it's kind of part of a larger family of relations, a network of pro Caesarian relations. And when Augustus says, "I'd like to marry your wife," he says, "Yes, that's okay." And in fact, he ends
Have
up like
her.
presiding over, yeah, yeah, and he actually presides over the marriage between the two. And in fact, um, there was an accusation in the March timeframe of that year that Livia's pregnant at this time, by the way, and gives birth to the man that we know now as Nero Claudius Drusus or Drusus the Elder. Tiberius is already born. He was born in 42, so he's already a 4-year-old at this time. And rumors went round that it's just an amazing fact that Augustus marries her, and within a matter of months, but not 9 months, out comes this baby. So it's miracles, miracles. But there's also an insinuation that maybe he had a relationship with her before Tiberius
Yeah.
divorced his wife. So, again, there are all of these sorts of things, and they're all in Suetonius that you can read about, and maybe questions that are on authenticity. But it's what we
I
got.
mean, they didn't have DNA tests at the time, so they couldn't be sure.
Well, that's right, exactly right. But what's very interesting is that the man who will become Augustus marries her even though she's pregnant. And what happens when she gives birth to Nero Claudius Drusus? He is sent over to the father, Tiberius Claudius Nero, with his older brother, and the two boys are raised by the
Mm.
father, not by the mother, for the first several years. And it's only when the father dies that they come into the household of the mother with Augustus at the time. So
Mm.
it's traditional marriage in one respect is that Augustus respects the rights of the paternal father, but he's got the wife by this time, and what's very interesting is that they themselves never have children. The only children that Augustus ever has is Julia, and that ends up with the controversy and
Yeah,
shame all, and so that's another
we'll come
element
back
of
to
this.
that later.
Sure.
So let's talk about the Ides of March then. And is Livia with August Octavian at the time of his death, or is she in Rome or elsewhere, or does she travel with him by the time by
No,
this time on the campaign?
so look, the dates. So 44 BC, the assassination year of Julius Caesar, and when Rome goes to hell, you might say. The young man Octavian is in the Western Balkans. He's
Yeah.
in what we now call Albania. And I don't know at this point that he even knows Livia Drusilla. I suspect that she is
Mm.
in Rome at this
Okay,
time
so she comes in
with her
later.
father. And her father is a very respectable Roman. It's interesting when you watch some of the TV series. There was one recently, I think it was on Showtime or something. I think it was called Olivia, wasn't it? And the point there is they show her very much under the influence of her father, and I would imagine that she was a very very smart lady. So why wouldn't she be amenable to the insights and teachings and nurturing and coaching of her father?
So let's talk about, sorry, Octavian. I'm trying to remember that it's not Augustus just yet, but let's talk about Octavian's reaction and what happening in Rome as the death of Caesar happens and the reaction. What happens next? What does Octavian? I mean, we know, but what happens? What does Octavian do, and what is the next step in the game? I mean, he's been adopted, and it's not just looks at himself as a natural heir, but also we have to remember Mark Antony is also in the picture, and he was also very close. And we know, and we'll talk about this obviously for the most part of this episode because it's kind of a big part of Augustus' life, the civil war that follows. But did they do it to work together eventually in the beginning? We discussed this on the podcast before as well when we talked about Agrippa for I don't know how many years ago now. Time flies, certainly,
Yeah.
but how where does the what happens now that Caesar dead and Brutus killed Caesar? Does Brutus expect to be take over as de facto ruler of Roman Empire or this Respublica, or does what's going to happen next?
So let's recap. So Julius Caesar sends his young great nephew to the Western Balkans, and he's being trained by the army. So in order to get anything to him, you've got to cross the Adriatic Sea. You've got to go all the way down to the heel of Italy, and it's going to take several days. So between the Ides of March and Augustus, as he will be, Octavian finding out is, I'm going to say something like 15 days. And what's very interesting is that he finds out at the same time probably as everybody else finds out. I mean, merchants are going around in boats, and the army commanders are learning because they're getting misses from different of their connections and so forth. And the army itself is almost quite decentralized. The army at this point is run by probably people under the influence of Julius Caesar, and of course he's not there to write the email, the letters to say things have changed. So that I think you have to understand there's a cloud of unknowing, and right in this cloud, on the edge, in fact, is the young Octavian, and he's got his friends with him, and he receives two letters. One is from his father, who basically says, "I would stay away if I were you. I'd keep out things about over in Rome." And the advice on the other side, his mother is, you should come back. You should come back ASAP."
Hmm.
And he discusses this with his friends, not least of whom is Marcus Agrippa, and he has four or five friends there. Salvidienus is one of the other characters who's very interesting. As an aside, it's very interesting. All through his life, the Octavian, who becomes Augustus, always takes the counsel of his closest friends. It's sort of part of his. I like to bounce ideas off you, and I'll make my decision based on the best information. So he has several of them. One is Salvidienus, one is Agrippa. There's another one. I think his name we only know as Lucius. And these have all gone out there. So he's surrounded by buddies and gets different perspectives. He makes the decision, we're going to go back. But we're not going to go back via Brindisium. We're going to go back by another port just in case people are out to
Hmm.
assassinate us. And in fact, he only learns about the will and his status as heir when he arrives at the house of not of the only,
Hmm.
interestingly enough, the one and only Cicero. And Cicero, who is privy to this information, says, "My boy, you should know you are in fact the heir to the
Isn't
great."
Caesar in exile at this time?
No. He's living down in Campania.
Hmm.
So he served out his consul. He's been a very active statesman. He's been writing letters to Atticus and various other people expressing his great concern about the way the Roman Republic is going, concentration of power in one man and so on and so forth. But he's very much alive. And what's also telling is that I think he has established that Antony is kind of an enemy to freedom,
Hmm.
the liberty of the Roman citizens. So there's a
Kind of
situation going.
ironic.
Well, but again, you're looking at a situation where it's a very competitive political scene. We are a republic at this point, so
Yeah.
on paper at least, you've got consuls changing every year who are working with the Senate and voting tribes of people, assemblies of various kinds, and it's supposed to work as it's a sort of conversation between Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and Roman people. And he's watching Julius Caesar sort of gradually acting more like an imperial leader, taking more and more power until actually at the start of 44 BC, he's actually declared dictator perpetuo, dictator forever, which is supposed to be an emergency power which lasts about 3 to 6 months. But now it's declared that he's basically a dictator forever. And that's the reason why you have the
Octavian.
so Octavian comes into this as the young man. He's 18,
Yeah.
right? And
I want to ask you,
effectively,
sorry for interrupting you 1 second, but you mentioned he's quite unknown at this time, right? But is there political enemies that, you mentioned the danger of enemies on the way back to Rome, but is he really in danger of political assassination that, people fear he might be, the next Caesar in a way, or is he a kind of an unknown entity in the Roman politics at this point in time that he doesn't really have to fear that, people are out to get him?
so let me take you back to the actual day of the assassination, the Ides of March. So after the assassination, which happens in the Theatre of Pompey, in the Curia at the Theatre of Pompey, not in the Curia Julia, which is actually still being built at this point. The assassins actually race out and they have their bloodied hands and they present to the people in the forum speaking from the rostrum, and Antony is left sort of devastated, covered in blood, and so on. And is faced with the dilemma: do I basically side with the assassins, but I'm also the master of horse of Julius Caesar, my friend? And he decides to sort of play a political game, which is
Mm.
I could be the next one to be bumped off. So I'll come to an arrangement with the assassins, and the assassins take to the Capitol Hill. And in the meantime, outside the city is Lepidus's army, right? Lepidus has brought his army because there was some other thing planned. And you've got this really fraught situation where the population is beginning to get very angry, somewhat agitated by Marcus Antonius, with the army of Lepidus there to actually sort of impose martial law, as it were. And then an accord is reached between the assassins and Mark Antony, where you know what, we'll turn a blind eye to this. We'll go back to the situation as normal. You guys can go and become governors of the different provinces of the Roman Empire. So Decimus Brutus, and they'll go off in different ways, which is astonishing to the young man who says, "Oh, I'm the inheritor of the great name of Julius Caesar, and I don't think this is right at all." So he lobbies Marcus Antonius, who is now the sole consul, right, and himself not doing the best things. I mean, he starts ruling with a certain arrogance, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I remember reading how he sort of rather liked some statues and things, and he'd actually put them in his house and he'd take them from other people or whatever. Um, and what Octavian tries to do is say, well, first of all, can we read the will and can we sort all this out? And Antonius plays a hard to get game and in fact pushes the young man away all the time until finally they reach a deal and then it's revealed that actually the money, the name, and a lot else will go from Julius Caesar to his great nephew, who now adopts the name of Caius Julius Caesar. And you can imagine that the game that Antonius played by keeping the young man at arm's length will have built a certain animosity between the two men. So Mark Antony is what, 50, something like that, and the other guy is not even 20. He's
Mm.
18, going on to be 19 in September. And what happens is that Octavian decides that his mission, his political mission, is to be the avenger of the name of Julius Caesar, that he
Mm.
will actually hunt each one of those assassins down and seek justice, which in most cases will mean their death. So, what emerges from this is a civil war. And the Civil War is basically Octavian siding with people who are pro Caesar, and all the other people who were saying, well, we are liberators. We removed the dictator and we wish to restore the good operations and workings of the Roman Republic. But that's not how it goes. In other words, the assassins achieved their first objective, which was to take the head off this dictatorship,
Mm.
but they didn't have a plan for after the Ides of March.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. So in the meantime, the Senate works and then basically decides, and Cicero is very much alive in this conversation at the time, decides that each of these assassins have got their provinces, and a a row breaks out because Marcus Antonius gets a province he doesn't particularly like. One of the other assassins gets it, and then this tension builds between Mark Antony, the Senate, and the assassins. And what effectively happens at this point is civil war breaks out in the north of Italy. And out of this, you find what's called the triumvirate, which is this committee between Antonius, Octavian, and Lepidus. And you've got to remember that Lepidus has the army, and Octavius is the man now with the name of Caesar. And using that name, he actually goes and gets an army. He goes all the way down to Capua. So think Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabia, those areas of Pontus, and actually calls on the old veterans of Caesar's army and say, I got this chest of gold here, right, from my father, because part of the will was that he got adopted. So he's not anymore a great uncle. He's actually his adoptive father. So now he refers to himself as the son of Julius Caesar. So we're moving ever closer to this halo effect of Julius Caesar's name and reputation rubbing off on the young man who, as I say, is only his 18th, 19th year. And this army is of interest to Cicero because they're now picking a fight with Marcus Antonius up in Mutina in the north of Italy. And what they try to do is persuade this young man, hey, we'd like your army. And the young man says, you'll have to make me consul first. And it's very interesting because he's 19. There's no way he should be consul. There are only two consuls anyway. And they played this really tough bargaining game, but they need his army because effectively there are no armies in Italy that are not allowed. So the Senate, and led by Cicero, one of his remarks in one of his letters, as I understand, is effectively, let's use him for his army and then use him by cutting his throat, effectively. Well, eventually he gives his army to the Senate, and this army goes to battle against Marcus Antonius. And in the kerfuffle, in the battle and the sieges that happen, there's a battle in Mutina. It turns out that Octavian and no Julius Caesar actually forms an alliance with Antonius. The two consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, frankly screw up and they fail to win the day for the Senate. And in the end, Octavian is able to come back to the Senate effectively in military armor and say, I'm here to collect my consulship. And the Senate basically laughs, at which point I think the guys around say, well, maybe these, exposing their gladii, these will
And
change your mind.
if we
So
have,
what
if I may interfere as well, we have to remember that consulship usually didn't you weren't allowed to be consul until the age of 30, and we have to remember
oh, it was
Octavian
at
is also
45.
oh
It was much later.
35,
It was
yeah, and
yeah.
also he's Octavian isn't even 35 yet, so
No, no.
no wonder that yeah, no wonder they were laughing
So
at him.
he probably hits about 22 by
Yeah,
all the time
yeah,
happening. So what's amazing is that some of these figures um, completely, I mean, you think about it, Marcus Antonius, Cicero, many of the famous men in the Senate have completely misread and misunderstood what this young man is capable of. It is quite extraordinary. And your question earlier was kind of, well, how did Caesar know him and so on? Well, it seems to be that he had either a natural instinct for politics, he had a brilliant strategic thinker's mind from a point of view of what needed to happen to achieve another political or
yeah.
military aim. But he was also, I think, smart enough to know that he couldn't actually do a lot of those things by himself. He was pretty good at picking people around him who could either consult with him to give him the best advice, or those people would go and do the job for him. And one of those is Marcus Agrippa that we talked about. He becomes instrumental in the civil war that erupts between the Senate and Marcus Antonius. And out of that comes this agreement between Octavius, Lepidus, and Marcus Antonius. And
what I want to ask about, and we just had to take a wee break, but we're back again now. But what I want to ask is, the relationship with, and this is an important factor as well, is the relationship between Mark Antony and Octavian, because they were quite got along. I'm not sure if close is the right word for it, but they did get along in the beginning until they turned bitter enemies. So where does how is the relationship with Octavian? And Mark Antony was much closer to Caesar than what Octavian were at this time because he campaigned with him in Gaul and he was ruler in his de facto ruler in this place when Caesar was fighting the civil war with Pompey and he. So you can't kind of understand. So what were the relationship with? But I mean, Mark Antony and Octavian at this point in time, at the early stages before they become bitter enemies, and Mark Antony sides with Cleopatra, eventually sides with Cleopatra. But what is their relationship like there?
Uh, I don't think there's one word that really captures it. It's a sort of phrase. So, as I explained earlier, in the wake of the Ides of March, in the year or so after that, uh, Antonius basically treats Octavian with disdain. So you can imagine if you're the young man who's been told, oh, you inherit vast riches and a title, and oh, by the way, your life is going to change totally. But in the way of doing all those things, as a man called Marcus Antonius, you might be a little bit angry. On the other hand, when all of that is resolved and we understand that Octavian is the inheritor of of Julius Caesar's estate and name, etc., well, that means that
Was it jealousy on Antony's part?
well, it's possible that jealousy does feature in this from that point on, because it's in fact not Marcus Antonius who is the designated heir. It's in fact his grandnephew who is made that. So the center of gravity shifts somewhat. And in the meantime, in the years over, the decade after the assassination of Julius Caesar, what Octavian's able to prove that he's a really sharp, wily political actor. I mean, he outmaneuvers the Senate and Cicero. He is able to raise an army, and the army is loyal to him and also to Agrippa. The two of them build quite a substantial army. And in the end, I think Marcus Antonius understands they probably have more political ground in common than they do different. And they can achieve more together. And of course, bringing in the third man, who's Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who is another experienced commander under Julius Caesar and has, some assets to bring to this conversation. And then really things start to go wrong, I think, where having created this committee of three, ostensibly for the restoration of the Roman Republic. They kind of carve up the Roman Empire into three pieces. And the result is that Lepidus gets basically Sicily and parts of North Africa, which is, arguably not a very good deal until you realize that's where most of the grain comes from, right? So that's an important
Yep.
thing. And then Octavian gets the Western, so he gets Italy and all the other provinces going all the way out to Spain. And let's not forget that Spain is not yet completely conquered by the Romans. There's still wars and things going on out of there. Sextus Pompeius, who is the son of Pompey, is waging a war of attrition in Italy. So there's that going on. And what happens to Antonius is he gets all the rich provinces out in the opposite direction. So basically, the Eastern Roman Empire, so that you think about it, is all the Balkans and Anatolia and all the way down the Levant, all the way Egypt. And that's where the money is, right? So you can argue the way that it's divvied up is that Antonius
It wasn't a very
gets
clever divide.
well, it's what it was. I mean, I
Mm.
don't know how that decision was arrived at. I dare say it was over some jugs of wine or something or other, and Anthony could be probably quite a compelling presence. I mean, there's no doubt he was charismatic, and maybe Octavian saw there was opportunity. I mean, he, after all, kept hold of Rome,
Yep.
right? So that's where the political center of the world is, and he is the big kahuna there. And also he is able to draw on some of the things that are going on. But the money really is in the other part of the empire. So you could say, well, There's opportunities on both sides, but the money is really on the east side. And of
Mm.
course, in the meantime, they're working together to hunt down all the assassins, and they go finally to the two battles at Philippi. And what's very interesting
Yeah,
there is
I
that
want to ask, I don't want to interrupt you there because we do have to
yeah,
introduce the other players that are also in the scene. I mean, if you remember, Brutus is one of the assassins of
yes,
Caesar, but there's also another player that is Pompey's son, and do forgive me, I don't remember his name.
yes,
But
Sextus.
there's these two that team up against Octavian. So let's talk about how, and you talked about the Battle of Philippi, but before we go to that, let's talk a little bit about the rivalry between these factions of powerhouses that, fighting for the control of the Roman Empire over public life, if you go to be historical correct.
Yeah,
So let's talk about the rivalry between these two powerhouses, as I'm
yeah.
gonna call it.
So Sextus, who's the younger son of Pompeius, Pompey the Great, Pompeius Magnus, really was also about reestablishing his father's reputation and name,
Hmm.
the proud old Roman house. And what I think we tend to forget is that Julius Caesar and Pompeius the father were related, in fact, because of the marriage of his daughter to Sextus Pompeius, to Pompeius Magnus, rather. He was actually a stepson, and in fact, Caesar was actually fond of Pompeius Magnus. So when the Ides of March followed the other act, which was crossing the Rubicon, right?
Yep.
So we have to rewind the tape a little bit here to establish where the roots of this thing are. So Julius Caesar had been given the province basically of Provincia, which would be Narbonese Gaul, but decided to take upon himself to actually create a much bigger opportunity for himself by taking on the Helvetii in eventually an 8-year war in Gaul, which he's famously written up as the commentaries on the Gallic War.
Yep.
And at a certain point, the Senate says this man is basically working completely outside his portfolio. We need to call him back and actually call him to account for this because this is completely out of hand. And Caesar says, I'd like to be consul if you don't mind before you do that. And the Senate says, no, you've got to come back, surrender your army. And what happens is that he takes the initiative. Actually, Marcus Antonius is a part of this, famously takes a legion with him and they cross the Rubicon and they go into Italy, which is an act of civil war. And the Senate, traumatized by something that somebody's not ever supposed to do, understands it now has to rally and fight Julius Caesar, and it looks to Pompeius Magnus to be his champion or their champion. Well, what does he do? Well, he's out in Spain, actually fighting the war there. He comes to Italy and says, "We must evacuate Italy, and we will come together in the Balkans. We will in the Western Greece. We'll stage a war to recoup our losses there." And this obviously results in a major civil war. And what's really very interesting is you've got two generals at the top of their game. I mean, Julius Caesar is at the top of his game. Pompeius the Great is also, and Pompeius is actually very popular. Roman people like him. So this war breaks out between the two, and it's a nearly run thing. At the battle, for example,
Mm.
of Dyrrhachium, Caesar kind of doesn't do so well. If you want to understand how these wars are fought, you should read the Civil War commentaries on the Civil
Oh,
War by
brilliant.
Julius
Yeah.
Caesar, and it's one of the most interesting and I think actually exciting reads because it's very much a series of sort of battle reports coming back, and you see the Roman army in siege warfare, digging trenches and really running for miles. I mean, Romans are sort of lobbing things at each other and trying to destroy each other's siege works and so forth. And ultimately, Caesar is able to pull off a win in northern Greece, and Pompey escapes. And when he arrives in Egypt, the young king there welcomes him by chopping off his head. And then when Caesar finally arrives to hunt the man down, is presented with the head, and he is absolutely distraught because he liked Pompeius. There was the way that Pompeius actually, sorry, Caesar seemed to work was he was very forgiving of his enemies. Brutus, for example, was one of those people who actually was forgiven. And I think it's sort of part of this, the sort of the big character of Julius Caesar is by making friends of his enemies, there's an idea that he holds a sort of spell over them. I've spared you some terrible consequences, at least exile or maybe capital punishment. And I just want from you your loyalty. And interesting enough, that's something I think that Augustus also learns and expects in his friends. So the fact that Pompey is killed by an Egyptian king really is not what he wants to see. But of course, for his young sons, provides a pretext for a vengeance. You know, they want revenge too. So, in the wake of the death of Julius Caesar, Sextus, who's now based out of Sicily, is waging a sort of piratical war. And in order to try and bring down the young Octavian, who, as you remember, he actually owns the Italy and the western provinces of the burgeoning Roman Empire,
Yeah.
the population of Rome has a large number of unemployed people, and they're basically given a corn dole, a modius sort of a day, and out of this they'll make their loaves of bread. And the corn is coming from Sicily. So these pirate ships, effectively run by Sextus Pompey, stop these ships coming into Rome, and it's a problem for a young politician trying to say, "I can manage the situation," when clearly the population say, "I'm hungry. I didn't get my bread today." So Sextus becomes enemy number one for Octavian, and he puts Agrippa in charge of basically trying to hunt this man down. And over the next couple of years, they build a fleet to try and tackle the naval problem that Sextus Pompeius represents. And at two battles, Naulochus and Mylae, I think they're in 36 BC, Agrippa with his big ships is able to defeat the small ships of Sextus Pompeius. And in the meantime, Lepidus is able to defeat the land army of Sextus Pompeius, and Sextus flees.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting, I think there's some double crossing and subterfuge, and in the end, Sextus is murdered himself. So it's a moment in the story of the emerging Augustus where he may also have lost it. But because he'd got these friends, particularly Marcus Agrippa, they were able to deal with the problem militarily, and that secured his political situation in Rome itself. But Sextus was, I mean, he was issuing coins. There's some of the most lovely coins you'll find in coin collections, with ships on the other side and a very dashing portrait of his father on the other, and they're very collectible coins. Um, and in the end, it turns out that it wasn't going to work. What's very interesting about this, by the way, as a footnote, is that the father of Tiberius and Livia Drusilla flee to Sextus Pompeius in those years for sanctuary. Because now they've decided they're actually not on the side of the people avenging Julius Caesar, they're actually on the other side. And they flee and they present themselves to Sextus Pompeius. And at this time, the father of Tiberius is a little baby at this point. So you can imagine, I mean, they're fleeing from place to place to place. And Sextus Pompeius, seeing that this man who's a magistrate with his lictors basically says, "You need to send away your lictors. You're nobody here, basically. I'm the guy in charge. You can't be having these people." And temporarily grants him sanctuary. What's very interesting, I think the people on Sextus's side are so smitten by this little baby, they give him a little gold bulla. And what's interesting, if you read the Suetoniuses of this world, I think he mentions in there that this bulla, which was given to young baby Tiberius,
Mm.
was still a thing. It was still an artifact that Roman tourists go and see after the death of Tiberius.
Mhm.
So it's just funny how we're looking at interlocking circles of people. This is a Roman society of big families with reach and networks of people, and they fall out and they travel and people switch allegiances and so on. And so you've got Livia tied up in that
Mm.
story too, but
So let's talk about the Battle of Philippi and the end of Brutus and Sextus, as you know, and rivalry, and how this would establish Octavian in
yeah,
power. And
yeah,
so, because it's quite an epic battle that would, it's
yeah,
also, I'm going to say, a kind of turning point in Roman history as well.
yeah. So let's get our dates, right? So we've just been talking about Sextus Pompeius and his death. So that was happening in 38 BC, right?
Yeah.
So Philippi happens in 42, so it's 4 years before.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yes, so that's a sequencing of events. And don't forget, 2 years before that, 44 was the assassination of Julius Caesar. It's a very short period of time that these
Yeah.
tumultuous events take place. And what's amazing is the distances that whole armies are traveling between Spain, Italy, and the Western Balkans. So to try and capture what's happening at Philippi, the uh, the Roman Senate, who had backed the liberators, who are mainly Cassius and Brutus, but there's also Decimus Brutus and a lot of other people. Some of them had actually been given provinces, as you know, they were one of them up in North Bithynia in Macedonia. They corral around Pompey Magnus. What's and his side, and they were unsuccessful in the early years before the Ides of March of actually defeating Caesar. So when the Ides of March takes place, that cadre, what's left of them, flee to Greece, and the way they equip themselves is not good. So if you read, for example, like Plutarch and other sources, they basically raided the Greek cities to fund their war effort. And that didn't, I mean, I seem to recall that I think,
That can help their popularity.
well, if I've got this right, and correct if I'm wrong, I think it's Cassius, for example, raids Corinth. And in fact, Plutarch's dad has to actually carry grain on board the ships in order to feed Cassius Longinus's army, I think. So you've got basically an army which is fighting a rearguard action, knowing that this now quite well organized army from Antonius and Octavian are going to cross over and they're going to hunt them down. I mean, in the meantime, Marcus Agrippa, by the way, has been raising court cases to find some of these men guilty. So one of the early things that Marcus Agrippa, as I understand, he actually represented the Roman state prosecuting Caius Cassius Longinus and won, but Caius Cassius Longinus, of course, was in absentia. He was, of course, elsewhere. And what they're now doing is going to exact vengeance. So they track them down to Philippi. And in two battles, what happens there is the two sides come together. And what you have to imagine is these two armies, which are vast armies, tens of thousands of men, basically separate themselves for entrenchments. So ditches and mounds of earth and stakes of wood. And these go on for miles. I mean, it probably in a way resembles a World War One trench warfare type scenario. And as one man in his unit on the one side is digging the trench, the other side is kind of basically tracking them all the way. And in October of that year, one battle happens and there's no particular winner. And in fact, it takes the second battle later, I think it's the 23rd, to finally resolve the issue. And in the meantime, what happens is Brutus commits suicide, and the intention of the Octavian and Antonian side is to capture these guys, hold them to account, and I presume execute them. Well, they're old style Romans, and they prefer to take their own lives or die fighting rather than do that. So,
Mm.
in the end of these two bloody days, lots of casualties, but the main culprits in the assassination are finally dead. They're not the last ones, but I mean they're the important ones. And what that essentially means is that Octavian can rule Rome as its sort of like savior, if you will, and Antonius can actually rule the Eastern, and they're the two
Mm.
big guys within the Roman state. What's very interesting also is that Octavian is still quite young at this point, and he develops a reputation of being someone that talks a big story, but come when rubber hits the road, he sort of is not there, and he famously
Kind of
falls
talk
ill.
the talk, but not walk the walk.
Yeah, well, so he falls ill before the battle. And there's a scene in one of the sources where basically Marcus Agrippa has to nurse him in his tent
Mm.
while the soldiers are fighting, and that's a source of mockery for him later in war. But what his physical condition was seems to have been weak when it needed to be strong. That's the way that the sources present him. But he was on the winning side. And what he was able to do as a result of that was to sort of establish his preeminence, having eliminated the liberators, so-called, of the war. And then for the next 2 years, they go hunting Sextus Pompeius. So that's how the chronology works.
Yeah. So when does the falling out of, Mark Antony and Augustus Octavian happen? So because that you talked about, they do go quite well along in the beginning, and we discussed this in previous episode that Mark Antony wasn't really a ruler. He was more the playboy, type, that liked to party and drink, but then he wanted the illusion of power. To quote Dennis Reynolds in From Always Sunny, he wanted the illusion of power, but not really the power, in a way, from my understanding. So he was more the party guy, and more the fun guy, but he didn't want to do the actual work that to retain the power. Where does the falling out between Mark Antony and Octavian happen that would eventually lead into the Battle of Actium?
So in the period after Philippi and what will be their demise in 30 BC, so we're talking a period of what, a decade? That there's an uneasy relationship between Octavian and Marcus Antonius. And what really seems to weaken the whole thing is that Antonius shows a real interest to become someone of great significance in the East. And in fact, he forms relationships with Cleopatra VII of
Yeah.
Egypt. And let's not forget that Caesar had relations with her before. Uh, what's important is, of course, is that Cleopatra rules a vast country with immense wealth, and of course, they also grow corn grain, which will also be of use to the Roman public. But long and the short of it is, I think it's fair to say that um, in the eyes of people in Rome, with a rather more traditional conservative aspect on the world, they're looking at this guy basically becoming a Greek Egyptian playboy and things come to a head where he has children by Cleopatra
Mm.
and starts
Twins, isn't
dividing up
it?
Roman. Pardon?
It is twins, isn't it? He had
Yes,
twins
so
by
yes,
Cleopatra.
yes, he does, and then the point is that he starts giving them territories which are supposedly Roman territories. He's not authorized to do that. Um, you could argue so. He's at different times consul, so he has the political power of the consul. But really, consuls are supposed to stay in Rome, stay in Italy at least, and if they leave, they're supposed to get the permission of the Senate. And at the same time, he's supposedly married, right? And in fact, insulting to Octavian is he allows his sister Octavia, who is a very well-liked individual in Roman society, he offers her to Antonius to seal their relationship. So we're talking about political marriages. Octavia becomes the sort of pawn in this political game. She doesn't get a lot of say in this. She's sent out to Athens, I think it is, with a small group of soldiers, a few cohorts. Antony is asking for ships and big armies and all sorts of because he wants to wage a war against Parthia. He sees glory against the Parthians in the way that Julius Caesar had thought to do but never actually was able to do because he was assassinated. So he is not prepared to go along with that. He said, "Look, my sister is going to come up with some troops. Please accept them." And Octavius, does that. I think knowing that it's a high risk but high visibility thing to do, probably anticipating that Antonius is going to do something quite insulting, which is he says, "Thank you for the army. You can go," sending Octavia away, which is very insulting to Octavia, who's a fine lady and also, of course, a spitting in the face of Octavius, who was the brother. So there begins to be a war of words between the two people. There are letters that survive in the sources where they're pretty nasty. So Octavian is calling Antony names, and Antony's calling Octavian names, and all those allegations of sexual impropriety or all sorts of character assassination that we talked about come into play. And it really comes to a head in the 30s BC. So with the divvying up of provinces to his family members, numerous failures of his army against the Parthians. He's taking armies out to the Media, and to Armenia, and losing troops in vast numbers, including the battle standards, which is not good because you remember that Crassus had done the same thing at Carrhae in 53. So this just rubs salt into a very deep sort of Roman feeling of shame at loss of those. And Cleopatra refuses to give him an army, but gives him the money to do all of those things. And finally, they seem to come to the conclusion, what we need to do is pick a fight with Octavian. So we can either eliminate him as a threat or defend our part of the empire and tell them this is ours now, this is not for you, and a sort of Roman Egyptian regime will rule in the east and Romans will have the west, and that's going to be the way the world is. So during the year 33, 32 BC, the Senate, egged on by Octavian, declares Queen Cleopatra an enemy. Now they are able to do that because she's a foreign queen, right? And rather than declaring Antony the enemy, they make her the enemy. So it becomes a foreign war rather than a civil war. And what they're able to characterize is Antonius as coming under the bad influence of a wicked queen. And of course, queens are always wicked in the Roman way of looking at politics. So they can indirectly fight Antonius by picking on Cleopatra. And they sail, Antony and Cleopatra, by now having a relationship for several years and children, they then move a fleet up onto the Western Balkans. And at this point, Antonius thinks that they can launch an invasion eventually against Italy at some point. So for the first several months of 31 BC, there is a stalemate between the fleet of Egypt and Antony in the Bay of Gomoros, in the Ambracian Gulf, which we now know to be near Actium. And Octavian and his general Agrippa now have to find a way to land troops on that side in order to be able to pick a fight with them. And what they do, first of all, is they capture Corfu. And having captured Corfu, they can then actually sail up and down the coast, picking off ships of Antony's navy as it's trying to actually get supplies. And very interestingly, is that in this way you see a role reversal, so that Agrippa becomes like the pirate in the same way that Sextus was to Octavian in Italy.
Mm.
He learned a lesson from that man. In fact, he was a very smart man in so many ways. And ultimately, what happens is that Octavian is able to move an army and a fleet to the other side of the bay. Bad news for Antony is he picks both sides initially, but is unable to hold the north side. So they basically are forced to take the southern side of the bay, which is swampy, which means that there's risk of things like malaria, whereas the fresh water and the dry ground is on the other side of the bay, which is now occupied by Agrippa and Octavian's forces. Antony has something like 19 legions and something over the order like 350 ships, including some huge big ships of the fleet from Cleopatra, some of which are bedecked in gold and apparently have the Egyptian treasury on board. And Octavian on the other side, under Commander Admiral Agrippa at this point, has a similar sized fleet, but it's of smaller ships. So they learned the Sextus Pompeius war from Mili and Nilochus, and they basically sit it out for about 3 months, waiting who's gonna come out and pick a fight. And they just basically play this game of wait, and that there are skirmishes on the land. Nothing of it seems to come of that. And then finally, at the end of August of 31 BC, there's a terrible rainstorm. It lasts about 5 days. And what we understand from the sources is that both of the commanders retreat to their respective tents to discuss with their war councils what are they going to do. And you've got people on both sides saying, well, we should retreat or we should fight. And eventually what happens is on the 2nd of September, the rain disappears. And there's a thing that there seems to be a mood that, in fact, they will actually go out to fleet. So Agrippa lays out his fleet in a great arc in the Ionian Sea. And on the other side, Antonius actually then deploys his ships, and they seek to come out of the Gulf of Ambracia. And the idea is going to be to engage the ships or to flee. And what seems to have happened in the case of this battle is that Agrippa was a smart individual and recognized that there was a wind, the Yapix, which sort of blew up, changed direction during around the midday part of the day. Yeah, so
Yeah, let's continue where we are. We had to take a
yeah,
wee break again. I apologize for that again, but
okay.
you were talking about how the beginning of Battle of Actium
Yeah. So
actually began.
if we were an eagle flying over at 10,000 feet looking at this area, you would imagine that on the one side, on the eastern side of this battle plan, you'd actually have a gulf. And on the south of that gulf is where Antony's army is and his fleets sort of in that bay. And on the outside of that is where Octavian and Agrippa have deployed their fleet in a great arc, a sort of a concave arc, which means that it curves outwards towards the sea. And in a sense, what he seems to be doing is inviting Antony and Cleopatra to come and sail out. It's a game of dare, if you will. And in fact, uh, Antony and Cleopatra gather their fleet. They take the masts down. It's going to be a rowing battle, and they sort of start to emerge out. And as this happens, Agrippa withdraws his fleet further into the Ionian Sea. And it would appear to be the game plan on his side was a bit like Hannibal did at Cannae, was to actually get the enemy's fleet to come out, and then they would envelop them and attack them from both sides and sink the ships. But actually, what happens in giving the command, the line sort of breaks up, and then this wind comes through. I mentioned the apex come through, and a break appears in the line of Agrippa's ships, and then the Egyptian ships, and apparently Cleopatra's ship hoists at the mast and a sail, which I understand is blue or purple, and it's filled with gold, and it sails through that line, taking the Egyptian ships with them. And these are big, big, big ships, five bankers or so, I think. And now you've got a dilemma. Does Agrippa and his commanders, his admirals and his navy, do they follow them or do they attack the rest of the fleet? And astonishingly, Marcus Antonius switches from his ship. He's dressed as a god Apollo, apparently, very showy. He jumps from his ship onto the Egyptian ship and they sail away, leaving the rest
Mm.
of the navy to do battle with Agrippa and Octavian, and the land army stranded. 19 legions are stranded on the mainland. And over the next several hours, all the way through the dawn of the next day, these ships are slugging it out. And it comes to a point where you've got, I mean, this is Roman military naval warfare in a great sort of spectacle.
Mm.
Is you've got big ships on the side of Antony's navy, and you've got smaller ships which are more nimble, and they're literally slipping around the sides and breaking the oars of the other side, crashing their great big bronze rams into the sides, sinking some of the ships. Ideally, Octavian wanted to capture the ships. It's very useful to have the other guy's ships to add to your own arsenal of weaponry. But as the night goes on, it seems to be that the combat gets pretty bloody, and then they start lobbing fire weapons across. So you're talking about arrows and so on, which have been covered with pitch and they're set on fire. And then you can imagine in this darkness, you've got people screaming and there's banging and clashing, and fire starts to break out on these ships.
Yeah.
By the time you get to dawn, it's very clear that Antony, who's left the battlefield anyway with Cleopatra, Octavian and Agrippa are the winners, and Octavian declares the battle is his. They then instruct their land armies to basically, you need to surrender to us. Antony's land army doesn't believe that their commander has been defeated, so basically holds their position until they finally surrender. And what's intriguing about this is that the dilemma that Antony and Cleopatra have is, of course, they've left their land army. They've got whatever they've got in Egypt, and they're selling their ships away. Having left the land army behind, Octavian has this huge, like 19,000 troops, as I seem to recall from my reading. And one of the things they do is they merge some of the units with their own on the promise, if you fight for us, it's okay, or we can demob you. So Agrippa is actually given the task of take the rest of these troops to Italy, find homes for them, demob them, decommission them as soldiers, and we got to carry on the fight. So what then continues is that the big question is, what will Octavian do now? Because
Mm.
Antony and Cleopatra are on the run, but the battle's not yet completely won. The Battle of Actium is won, the Actian War is won, but the total war to eliminate Antony and Cleopatra has not yet been won.
How does Antony fleeing with Cleopatra with a tail behind his leg reflect on the Romans as a whole and reflect upon him as, the famous saying where, people someone go to him and tell him, I don't remember exactly what he says him, but Anthony answers, who cares I'm screwing the princess? But how does his escape reflect upon the Roman people and the faith in Antony as a
So,
whole?
so this is one of the questions I think that again, you look at the ancient sources and historians of the modern era, we debate, for example, what was Antony's plan? And some will say Antony was out there to destroy the enemy at any means, and he screwed up, and that didn't happen. On the other hand, people will say, well, actually, his mission was to break out of the Gulf of Ambrosia, taking as much of the fleet as he could will to fight another day. And they, in that regard, they succeeded because they took the gold of Egypt back with them, so they could actually simply go buy another army. They abandoned the one that they had, but they could go and get another army. The key thing is the two leaders of the army and navy were actually still alive. And there's a third possibility. He was going to fight and take his chances in the naval battle. Well, that lasted all of a couple of hours
Mm.
because he sailed away when there's opportunity. So was he let down by the Queen, who basically sailed her ships out, or was that always the plan? We don't know. And part of the problem is again is that the sources that we have were basically written under Augustus and later.
Yeah.
So when you look at the way that the whole war is presented, there are some absolutely beautiful coins that come out around about this time in the next 5 or so years, where you'll see trophies depicted, which is the prow of a ship and clusters of arms and spears and helmets and all this. Trophies, which are basically a victor's prize over the fallen enemies, the point where they turn and run. That's what tropion means in Greek. So there's this propaganda, if you will. I use the word carefully. There's this messaging of trying to show that Actium is a key pivotal point in Roman history. Some military historians would say it wasn't such a big of a deal, but I would argue it was significant because
Yeah.
had they won, it would mean that Antony and Cleopatra could have, if they wanted to, landed an army in Italy, and quite what would have happened at that point is anybody's guess. I mean, the fact that Octavian was effectively a sort of debt financed operation at this point. He was borrowing people's money, and ultimately he has to go get Egypt to get the gold to go pay the lenders, the creditors who'd actually backed his campaign. Whereas Antony and Cleopatra already have the money, so they can keep fighting as long as they can raise an army. That the problem on Antony's side is that he'd already shown he's not quite a good general anymore. He might have been okay under Caesar, but he's been fighting in Persia, Parthia rather, and Armenia, and actually lost pretty much the entire campaign and all of his armies. So I just wonder whether, when you look at all of this, it's really hard to make head or tail. But for the people in Rome, you have to remember that as part of this declaring war on Cleopatra and Antony in parenthesis, is that the Roman population were required to swear an oath of allegiance to Octavian, right? The only people not were the family of Antony out of respect. They wouldn't expect them, so they didn't expect them to do it. So you already have a situation where all of Italy is expecting to be backing the winner. And they had already decided that Antony and Cleopatra were the bad guys in this conflict. So it was a validation and a vindication of them
Mm.
taking that stance. When the
So did it
news,
ruin his reputation in a way when he fled with Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, or did it kind of, what do you
I
expect
would
kind of thing?
argue for the fact that the Senate at this time has a large number. You got to remember after the Civil War, Philippi, a lot of the family members, the great families of Rome that were the traditional stalwart members of an older conservative style of Roman Republic, were dead. They died in the Civil War. They
Yeah.
died at Philippi, right? So a lot of the people in the Senate are actually Octavian's men and Antonius's men, who are, let's call it Caesarians in the broadest sense. Now it comes down to, well, actually, the person who betrayed us is Antonius. So this war of words that was happening in 33, 32 BCE, I mean, already his reputation was pretty bad. The fact that when he was made consul for the year 31, he didn't even show up. He was actually in Athens. Again, showed profound disrespect. So I think a lot of Romans would have said he got what was coming to him,
Yeah.
but there were lots of people who actually liked Antonius too. I mean, I think it's fair to say that he was one of the original guys that campaigned with Caesar, who of course now is made a god. And now let's remember that the name of Octavian, remember we started the show where we call him Caius Octavius Turnus, and
Yeah.
then on adoption he becomes Caius Julius Caesar. In the 30s, when he's fighting Sextus Pompeius, he adopts the name Imperator as his first name. So he
Mm.
becomes Imperator Caesar. If you look at all the coins, they call him Imperator Caesar, Commander Caesar. This is astonishing because when an army declares for its commander, it's called acclamation. They punch the air and they say Imperator, Imperator, Imperator. And that is a title which is then given to that general who puts it at the end of his name. So Marcus Antonius has coins where there's imp in it, right? He was declared by his own
Mm.
troops. But Octavian puts it as his first name. He does away with the Caius. He wants to be called Imperator by first name. You address him as commander. I mean, how about
We
that for?
also have to talk about up until this point, Imperator was a title given to certain generals as an honorary title, right? That it wasn't
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
what we
and all
think
the
about as
great,
emperor
yeah.
at this
So
point.
that's right. It does not. It just simply means commander. So the great generals of Roman history would have been acclaimed by their troops, their
Only
fellow
certain
citizens.
few were honored to be titled Imperator for, Roman triumph.
Well, so that a triumph was a separate thing. I mean, triumph could
Yeah,
be awarded. You could actually be acclaimed imperator, but you wouldn't necessarily get a triumph.
yeah,
So my point is this: is that to go back to the naming, don't forget that one of the things that Octavian did was to actually declare Julius Caesar a god. Divus Julius. And in fact, in I think it's 43, 42, is a comet appears in the sky, the Sidus Julius, and they say, you see, there is the spirit of Julius as he becomes a god. And what that means is Imperator Caesar is also Divi Filius, son of God,
yeah.
son of a god. So what's amazing, the man that goes to Actium and defeats the Queen of Egypt is Imperator, commander, Caesar, son of God. And I think what you have to
A
understand
long
that
title.
position, yeah, well, an extremely well crafted political and religious title, because as my late friend Carl Galinsky said, and I remember it to this day, it's very hard to argue with the son of a god.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, you can't argue with that.
No, but what it means is it positions this man who has defeated the assassins, the liberators of Julius Caesar, has defeated Sextus Pompeius, who has tracked he's actually dealt with the two enemies of the Roman state, Antony and Cleopatra. He's done all of that, and he's still only, what are we talking about, sort of 30, something like that, maybe
Yeah.
young 40s. It is an extraordinary story. And
Even
going back
I'm
to,
30 now, and what have I done with my life?
I mean, Julius Caesar must have seen something in this young teenager. Was it a ruthlessness? Was it an intellectual characteristic or set of
Yeah,
skills? Was he just a good listener and a good student? What was very interesting, I come back to this idea that he would surround himself with people. He surrounded himself in the early days with people who had been advisors and friends of Julius Caesar. So he got to know the mind of Julius Caesar.
yeah.
And I think that's very important. And that made him different. Who other people who would probably be very confident of their own skills. This man is willing to take the counsel of others. He will make the decision, but he'll hear out other people's. And at this point he has
And that's good
Agrippa.
leadership skills.
I think
Unlike a
it is.
certain somebody I can think of in the White House right now.
Oh well, I'm not at liberty to comment on those things, but the point is, I think what it highlights is he is prepared to be ruthless in striking bargains with people. So with Cicero is you can use my army, but you make me consul. And when they sort of double cross him, he turns up with the army and yeah, and they basically takes the consulship, becoming like one of the youngest consuls ever, and that sort of a set. So
Yeah,
what you see all the way through his career, and this is a point at which to say, in between this and the next podcast, maybe the thing for people to do is look up Res Gestae on the internet in English translation, and you will see the achievements of the divine Augustus, and it's his testimony, if you will, to the world of what I did. And what's very interesting, he puts all of these things, how he, as a young man, defeated the faction that were against the Roman Republic. And he goes through all of this list of things. And it's a fascinating document. I've just written an article for Ancient Warfare where I talk about how Augustus used his defeats in Germania and changed the narrative. And he does this a lot through his Res
which we
Gestae.
will
So,
talk about in the next episode, of course.
which we're talking about in the next episode.
And I think we're gonna round it up there because we decided to split this into a two-part episode because the life of Augustus is simply too big to cover in one episode. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we missed in this episode that we didn't have time for, but of course there is always other episode to cover those as well. Stay tuned for next week when part two, where we will take a look at Augustus in power, the fall of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and of course the Teutobod First and Livia, and some of the rumors surrounding a certain princess, if I dare say, Julia, and of course her affairs as well, and Augustus, the family man. We got a lot to cover next week as well. So stay tuned for part two. This has been When That Age 12. Of course, before you go, where can people find you on social media if they have further questions? And of course, check out the other episodes we have done. We have done several, including the first thing you did on the podcast where we talked about Germanicus, we have talked about Agrippa, we have talked about the Julio-Claudian dynasty in another two-part episode that we did. The last episode we did was on Tiberius, which we did last year. And of course, this time we are talking about Augustus. You have written that, and I think you can see it in the background. I read about the Tiberius book, which is Augustus Man at War, where you of course write more in detail about what we discussed in this episode. So that's where can people find your work, and of course your most recent work, which is Tiberius. And of course, again, check out that episode as well. It's the longest episode in the podcast, but it's well worth checking out, and it was so much fun to record. Where can people find you, and where anything else you want to promote, your books, and of course other works that you want to share right now?
Yeah, thank you. So my website is lindsay-powell.com. You'll find links to content that I put together. All the books are listed in there. There's some downloadable articles and things of that nature. I'm on Twitter, X, as at Lindsay_Powell. I'm also on Blue Sky, where my name is Lindsay Powell also, and you'll find me on Facebook as Lindsay Powell Author.
Thank you again for coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. This has been With That Aged Well. You can find us on Twitter as well, and the With That Aged Well Instagram, With That Aged Well. And we are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, consider to give us 5 stars, leave a comment. If there is other aspects of a justice life that we may not have time for to cover today, I feel like we covered quite a lot of ground of our justice early life. Of course, next week we will cover a lot more, so stay tuned to that. We are on YouTube, so leave a comment and there, like, share, and subscribe this as well. If you're on Apple Podcast, leave a comment and just leave a review. Give us 5 stars. And of course, if you hate this podcast, leave a 1 star. It's a free country at least in this part of the world. I don't know about the United States at the moment, but at most other places, it's a free country. So this has been With That Aged Well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time. Stay tuned for part two, which will be available next week.